Well, today is the day for cross-section talk. So my last video discussing port volumes and so on, by no means was an all comprehensive about port volumes, but it was enough. The whole goal is I want to get you guys thinking, because again, my bitch and complaint right now about the industry is the internet, false information, so-called experts that don't even do half the things they talk about, and they have no experience. So, the other thing that's muddy in the water sometimes in this industry is people don't stay in their lane. So what I mean by that is, let's say this guy has an opinion, this guy has an opinion, they're trying to flood that on everybody. And a lot of times, let's say this engine builder has an opinion on what cylinder heads he needs. Well, is he a cylinder head? Is the engine builder a cylinder head guy? Does he design cylinder heads? Does he work with these every day? No, but some engine builders are fantastic, where they have a great knowledge, great understanding, they have enough experience paying attention and trying to learn different aspects of cylinder heads. So not just engine builders, we're talking about everybody. Cam guys, it's like a cylinder head guy trying to tell you, do we have enough knowledge to build a phenomenal engine? Yes, because we have a wealth of knowledge of people that we're working with. But every time I give somebody advice about building their engine or what combo they should go with or what components they should use, it's my opinion. And so I always make it clear, hey, whoever's building your engine or whoever is doing this entire package for you, you should probably try to work with one person. It goes all the way back down to the same theory of, to have a successful racing program, you need a team around you. Individuals do not win races. Teams win races. And when I say team, it's all the way from the guy who built the car, the guy that manages the car, the driver of the car, the owner of the car, the people helping with all aspects of the car. That's what creates a winning combination. So sometimes people get, too tied up in, oh, this is a magic set of cylinder heads, or it's a magic camshaft, or it's this engine builder is better than everybody else. At the end of the day, it takes a team. So let's get back to a little briefing on cross-sectional area. So another thing is cross-sectional area, there's not just one formula, one size fits all. So cross-sectional area is very dependent on different applications. What are you trying to do with the car? Is this a drag race application? Is this a road race application? Is this Formula One? Is this turbocharged? Is it naturally aspirated, et cetera, et cetera? And even within those different categories, there are a lot of different minor changes or what a cylinder head guy, like we all have our own styles. So at the end of the day, we have a different approach. A lot of us get to the finish line the same way or different ways, but we all get there for the most part. But I wanted to kind of, again, get you guys thinking about cross-sectional area, and don't just think that one size fits all. Don't think that there's just one way to do it. So let me kind of give you some breakdowns of some simple things. So I just grabbed 4 random cylinder heads that we had in the shop that we're working on currently. We've got a small block Chevrolet, 23-degree cylinder head. We have an LT1, stock GM casting, stock valves, everything. An LS1 head with an aftermarket 2040 intake valve. We have one of our older SB 2.2. It was originally started as our NASCAR program, and then we've got different variations. But the one we're actually measuring right now that we're using in comparison is our more drag race friendly application. So what I did, just for quick numbers, is I took the cross-sectional area at the flange. So that's basically the area right here at the flange of the cylinder head. And again, I just got rudimentary with a caliper measurements. And these are the cross-sectional areas of each of these heads. Okay, so what I did, this is the valve size, and this is the cross-sectional area at the entrance. Okay, this isn't average cross-section. This isn't minimal cross-section. I'm just using these so we have some base points so we can kind of refer to. So one thing that we all consider is, again, what's the application? So valve size doesn't always dictate cross-section. So if I've got a large cubic inch, high RPM, I need a whole lot more cross-sectional area than if I was revving this. If I'm at 10,000 RPMs versus 8,000 RPMs, same exact valve size, same exact everything. Just same cubic inches, just increasing RPM. I need more cross section. But let me throw some loops in there. So like a small block Chevrolet, and so what the taper rate I'm referring to here is the minimal cross section versus the flange, okay? So your flange cross section isn't always your largest cross section, but it's a decent reference. So in a small block Chevrolet, and this is a pretty standard 280 intake valve, you know, intake port flows 330, 325, somewhere around there. It only has a 4% taper rate. So the port really doesn't transition quite a bit as it's entering the minimal cross section. The minimal cross section for us that we're referencing right now is the throat area. In the small block Chevrolet, the minimal cross section is actually the pinch. So in a small block Chevrolet, you know, you've got an area after it goes from your flange, it rolls in and the cross section actually gets smaller. Sometimes, you know, obviously in the perfect world, we don't want it to be smaller, but a lot of times that's a tool we use, because if you get the cross section to pinch in, then it accelerates the air and it turns and it gets, you know, it gets its own, like a fresh breath of velocity right there after that pinch. And so then it helps carry the charge to the belly. Where, as you can see in LT1, the flange is 3.7 and it has a 22% taper rate. And we hardly increase the area at the flange versus stock. Like we just enough to kind of square it up, clean it up. So this isn't drastically different than stock. Just, you know, so you guys can kind of see the drastic difference. The LS1 cathedral port only has 2% taper rate. And it even has less than that because on a cathedral port, if you're measuring the cross section at the flange, you have to take in consideration fuel injector location. So in the intake manifold, the fuel injector actually fires right here in this crevice. If you actually bolt an intake manifold on there, it sits like this. So your intake manifold only sees this window, and then this is your fuel injector port. So if you actually take this minimal area out, you have zero taper. It's probably -1% taper rate to the valve. Then you have your SB2. SB2, again, reference 26% taper rate versus the valve size, or versus the throat size. So the other thing I want to talk about a little bit is the way taper rates and all of this stuff play as a package. So again, let's go back to the fact that, you know, you don't want somebody doing your cylinder heads, a different guy doing your intake manifold, and you know, cams are kind of its own unique animal because, you know, usually cylinder guys, manifold guys and stuff aren't doing camshafts for you. But take this into consideration. So a lot of guys, let's say in LS world, rave about, you know, cathedral port is still, you know, the best port velocity, yada, yada, yada. I think it's a great head in the right application. Do I think it's the be all? Absolutely not. Do I think an LS7 headed cylinder head is too big for a 388? Absolutely not. Because that seems to be some hot topic right now is, oh, see, cathedrals are still cam. Well, that's all bullshit. So the difference is, let's take this in consideration. You have this cathedral head here that has almost no taper rate. And I'm trying to design an induction package. So what sits on top of the cylinder head? The intake manifold. Most LS intake manifolds in the industry have a set taper, whether you're running a high ram, you're running a, you know, MSD, whatever it is, stock manifold. So your manifold up here has an opening in the plenum, and that has a taper down to your cylinder head. Here's your cylinder head port. Okay, and then your port has its own path of taper and transition. Okay, so if I have something that has less taper rate at the flange, a lot of times it will run better with stock style intake manifolds, unmodified intake manifolds, or out of the box intake manifolds, whether it's, it doesn't matter. Because that manifold has this taper rate built in at, we're just using numbers. Let's say it's 20% from the plenum to their flange is their taper rate. Well, if the head doesn't have any more taper rate, now this is basically a really long, high velocity taper rate. If you have the head that is, let's say, LT or something that's 20 something percent. Well, now your manifold rate and your manifold rate and your head rate don't work well together. Or you need to do it in an intentional manner. So a lot of times, like when we used to do a lot of the NHRA Pro Stock, especially the carbureted stuff, we would intentionally put a choke somewhere in the system. So you'd have your carburetors up here, and we would intentionally choke the runner somewhere to create another spike of velocity somewhere in the middle of the track. So it was almost like a two-part system. Where a lot of our LS stuff that we're designing, if you're using our LS head, we might have, you know, let's say, I don't know, we're just using numbers, 10% taper rate on our F series or something. Well, when we design our manifold, if we know that I have 10% taper from the flange of the head to the valve of the head, then I'm going to take that in consideration when I'm building my manifold runner of, okay, well, if I want 30% overall taper, or I want 40%, or I want whatever number you're shooting for based on RPM, length, and so on, then the way this port tapers is going to affect the way I design my intake manifold. So all I'm trying to get you guys, again, use your noggin, is that mix and matching parts from different people is not usually the best way to do it. Or if you're going to do that, have people communicate. Again, it goes back to the team thing. Because if I know I'm going to use, you know, a high ram and that only has 15, 20% taper, but I'm going to use this cylinder head, maybe that manifold needs to be adjusted. Maybe it doesn't. So keep that in mind, that you always have to think of things in the entire system, not just, oh, my head does this and my manifold does this. It has to work together. So I wanted to make that a point too, because on top of, you know, getting involved with taper rates and cross section in the port, you have an intake track on the manifold side that is a whole nother animal too. And then, let me really get you, is when you start throwing fuel in the mix, because a lot of that changes. Is your fuel being induced up here? Is it being induced here? Is it here? You know, you get the drift. Is it DI? So all those things drastically change the way your head needs to be and your intake manifold. Again, I know we're referring back to Pro Stock, and some people in this industry say Pro Stock has no relevance to anything else. Well, I mean, you know, these are all air pumps, right, guys? So, you know, anybody that says Pro Stock's irrelevant, they just pull their head out of their ass, because, you know, it just is what you. Anyways, we won't get on that tangent. But at the end of the day, when Pro Stock went from carburetors, putting fuel in way up here into a plenum box, and then all of a sudden they went to an EFI, we all lost like 75 horsepower overnight. It was like fucking nightmare. And we were chasing that we chased it for at least a year with different R&D. We moved injectors, we did all the things. I'm not gonna get into what made us successful in that, but at the end of the day, what I can tell you is that cylinder head and that manifold was nowhere close to the old stuff. So again, you got to keep that in mind. Again, and so all we're trying to calculate here is, this is just a general idea. So the one thing I hate is, again, there's no one size fits all. And I'm not going to speak for every cylinder head guy out there, but when I go to design an intake port, exhaust port, chamber, whatever, I don't get out my calculator and all my formulas and say, okay, well, this is what I have to meet. I go and I put a shape. So the one thing I want you guys to think about is, screw cross-sectional area in a sense. It's important, but let me throw some curveballs. But the key is quality air, not quantity, and not, you know, velocity. Yeah, everybody talks about velocity, but you only need 300 feet per second over short term. You only need 300 feet per second to fill a cylinder efficiently. If you have more, awesome. If you have less, not so great. But, you know, people think you need these astronomical, you know, velocity numbers and so on inside the ports. And actually, let me clear something up. An LS1 head, everybody sits there and says, oh, it has all this port velocity because it has small CCs. Well, that's where everybody gets confused with this CC and cross-section. Because what happens when you take an orifice? So if I have basically a negative taper rate or even no taper, my air comes in my port, carries, and it actually expands. Because as it gets to the short turn of this port, it's actually growing in cross-section. So the air is actually going to slow in velocity and in overall feet per second to make this turn. So one thing I think people get tied up on the cathedral ports is all velocity, velocity, velocity. Well, what if you flip that and say, well, maybe it's not velocity, but maybe it's the fact that it can actually turn the air at a lower RPM, lower airspeed, because as it expands, it makes the turn. And then you utilize more of your valve area for your port window. So versus something like an SP2. So now you have a lot of cross-section at the flange, minimal cross-section at the throat. This is actually going to create, it's a constant taper rate all the way down. So it's going to constantly gain velocity as it's entering the valve seat area. So a lot of times, the hard part about this is we have to control this air and get it to turn. So cross-section isn't always the goal. We're not always shooting for a number. We're trying to manipulate air. We're like magicians, okay? So let me put it in this way. Let's say I have intake port shapes, as you can see here. Okay, they're all different shapes, sizes. Okay, so going back to quality, let's not worry about anything else. Let's worry about quality of airflow. What can the motor actually use? What's efficient? Are we carrying fuel? Are we not carrying fuel? We'll get on that in a minute. So these are all different shapes you can use. Let's say that they all have identical cross sections. Let's say they're all cross-sectional area of, let's just pick a number, 3.0. So in the normal world of the internet, everybody would be like, oh, okay, well, I'm advertising the cylinder head that we do. It's 3-inch average cross-section, blah, 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 blah. All the things that people want to advertise and market. But the key is these all do different things. They all perform completely differently. So when I say quality, when you have air coming through a shape like this, you very rarely have any kind of saturation in your corners or your wall, because the tight corners are going to create a little bit faster air velocity. Air is going to want to come to the center of the port a little bit more. When you have a shape like this, it tends to want to utilize more of that port window. Not always, but usually it's going to want to utilize more of this port window. Now, let me throw you a little trick. Some things that we do here at Fed that most people don't get to see, because this is like when we're class racing or we're hired to go win a championship for a division and there's rules or so on, we'll do odd things, right? But for instance, we had a head that we had to design, there were CC rules, yada, yada, yada. By creating this shape at the flange, we wanted to saturate more of our air flow and more of our quality on the roof side and get it to attach because of the way the short turn shape was. And so we needed everything to kind of attach to the ceiling a little bit more than the floor. And so this shape and the radiuses gave us a little bit more saturation area on the top side of the port. And the bottom side was kind of a dead zone. So this was able to utilize the cross-sectional area that we could achieve with the CCs, because that's the other thing is a lot of these rules is, you can only do a certain port volume. Well, if you're only able to use a certain port volume, you want the most efficient air charges possible. And so that's where it all comes down to port shape. Because inside the intake port, I might start with a shape like this, and inside the port, I might have a shape like this. And as I exit the port, it's gonna be round, but like you get the drift. Like you can manipulate air by changing shapes and radiuses. I mean, there's some areas in ports that we do where over the short turn, and this is the valve guide, and we take all the area out of the roof side, and we want everything to focus and rotate over the short turn and spread out over the floor. So again, this cross section is a very odd shape. And I'm not shooting for this magic number. Sometimes my cross section in certain areas are extremely large because I'm trying to get that air. I'm trying to play that manipulation game with the air, you know, and if I'm carrying fuel with it, fuel takes up volume. So another thing is if you have a cross, you know, like the cross section, as you can see on these different things are so drastically different, but the LT1 head has a small valve, okay, but it has a lot of area at the flange for the valve, and it has a really strong taper rate, but it doesn't carry fuel. So there's no fuel there that it needs to carry. So things will act a lot differently also in that manner. So when you going back to the, you know, cross-sectional area, I want people to stop thinking that there's these set numbers that you need to have, that this guy says I need this because my motor is this big and it's this RPM, so on. Because a lot of this also changes with camshaft, because you can manipulate the characteristics of a cylinder head with the dynamics of the camshaft, or vice versa. If you have a really good cylinder head, you need to minimize the dynamics of the camshaft because the cylinder head is going to be efficient and you won't have the same pumping losses. So the gist is, guys, don't take cross-sectional area and throw it in one basket. It doesn't work that way. It never will work that way. I hope I didn't confuse anybody, and maybe I'll touch base on this again a little bit more. But the gist is, if I can have all these different shapes and all have the same cross-section, but each one of these is going to run differently on the track, it's going to make different power, it'll make different power at different RPM levels, then that should tell you alone that this number is not the magic number. It's, again, you have to have the intake port, exhaust port, combustion chamber, it's a team, right? So everything's working together, all the way up to the intake manifold, all the way down to the headers and exhaust. Everything has to work in unison. And no cylinder head, all these different numbers, cross-section, port volumes, all this stuff is only relative to what you're trying to accomplish. And if you ask 10 cylinder head guys out there, they're gonna say, I put a port and a shape in there. I might use a flow bench, might not, because based on your experience, you know what works, what doesn't, what you're shooting for. And most of us that really know what works, we're not sitting out here trying to advertise bullshit flow numbers and give you all this marketing information to buy our product, because at the end of the day, we know the product is the best for what we're trying to do it, what, like the application we're using it for. Now, you want the best of the best, like let's say everybody calls Fed and says, oh, well, you know, I don't know, for instance, let's say maybe one of our cylinder heads made less power than somebody else's cylinder head, but they were used, our product was used in the wrong application and nobody knew right from wrong. That happens. We dyno test a lot of people's product. We have our own dyno. Like, we know what power our stuff makes in comparison to all the competitors per the same application. So I guess, again, you know, one size doesn't fit all. Build a relationship with somebody, stick with them, you know, create a team, and you'll win championships. So again, don't be a sheep. We don't like sheep around Fed, and you need to use your brain and help grow this industry, not crush it with all the negativity going around. So knowledge is your best friend. Use it. Bye.
Sweet.